So I'll talk for the next 30 minutes on a body of work that I've been contributing to along with many others in the field, in the interdisciplinary field of diabetes and cardiovascular disease, where we, over the last 15 or so years, have generated an abundance of evidence for cardiovascular effects of these novel anti-hyperglycemic therapies and expanded them from being anti-hyperglycemic therapies to being cardiovascular therapies, and oftentimes for certain indications independent of the presence of diabetes. So I've spent 30 years doing large-scale international clinical trials in the cardiometabolic space, working with drug companies to design and conduct their clinical outcomes trials, phase 3 and sometimes phase 4 trials, to bring drugs to market with novel indications, focusing primarily initially on cardiovascular safety of antihyperglycemics, and ultimately, as you know, we've proven some efficacy, incremental efficacy, not just for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, which is where we really started the focus of these cardiovascular safety assessments, but also in the domain of heart failure and kidney disease. So just as a reminder, it was December 2008 when the FDA and at the same time the European Medicines Agency flipped the switch and said, from this day forward, every new drug for type 2 diabetes has to undergo formal cardiovascular safety assessment before penultimate approval and permanent approval for marketing. And what that meant was, before this guidance in 2008, you could bring a diabetes drug to market with as little as 250 patient years of exposure in humans. You only had to have 100 people treated for 1 year with the drug. So we were bringing drugs to market effectively not having studied them in humans. And of course, when we do that and they get exposed to millions of people around the world, we see a number of adverse effects that we would only have seen had we done large-scale randomized trials. So this changed the paradigm. This increased the patient year exposure required for approval from 250 to 15,000. So a 70-fold increase requirement for resources and money, and recruiting the patients was felt to be a challenge at the time. But as we see looking backwards, we met all of those challenges. We were able to fund the trials. The sponsors were able to conduct the trials. We were able to find the patients. And in fact, all of these diabetes trials, I'll show you, virtually every single one of them enrolled ahead of timelines, which I have never seen in my cardiovascular clinical trials experience in other domains. So let's start with the classes. So we first embarked on these cardiovascular outcome safety assessments with the first class of medicines that were on the table at the time, the dipeptidyl peptidase 4 inhibitors. These are once-daily tablets. They inhibit the endogenous degradation of GLP-1. It's a lot like sacubitril in Entresto. Sacubitril inhibits BNP degradation and potentiates its action. In this case, these drugs inhibit DPP-4 and potentiate GLP-1 action. And so by doing so, GLP-1 axis affects glucose-appropriate insulin secretion. So these drugs met several of the challenges we'd had for decades with the sulfonylureas, is that these drugs do not have associated hypoglycemia, and they're weight neutral, if anything, maybe slightly weight negative, so overcoming the obstacles. So these were widely embraced by the endocrine and primary care community to effectively replace or take over for the sulfonylureas. And then we did the trials. We have 4 randomized trials of 4 different once-daily tablet DPP-4 inhibitors, and they're ordered from top to bottom in the order in which they were completed. So the first was SAVOR-TIMI 15. This was a 14,500 patient trial. This was the largest diabetes trial ever conducted at the time. I was on the executive committee. We studied saxagliptin versus placebo in persons with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or ASCVD risk. And the primary outcome for all of the trials I'll be talking about, the primary outcome was cardiovascular death, MI, and stroke, triple composite. And all of these trials I'll show you were primarily designed to prove non-inferiority, that is, to claim safety of the compound. And to claim safety, the FDA set the bar that the upper confidence limit of the point estimate, the upper confidence limit has to be below 1.3. And so you can see all 4 of these trials have an upper confidence limit below 1.3. So all 4 of these trials were positive. By the way, they were primarily designed, but they were positive for non-inferiority. They had absolutely no efficacy increment. And if you do a meta-analysis across these trials, you end up with a hazard ratio of 1.0, meaning we spent about $2 billion to prove that these are perfect placebos. They do absolutely nothing for cardiovascular risk. So we presented a sub-study of the TICOS trial of sitagliptin. Again, all of these had a point estimate almost of 1.0. So I was on the executive committee of TICOS. We presented a heart failure sub-analysis at the European Society of Cardiology, and you saw Gabriel Steg this morning speak, and Gabriel was the discussant for our late-breaking clinical trial presentation. And after we presented our TCOS data showing that sitagliptin had no effect at all on heart failure, Gabriel got to the podium and said, we have to stop doing what we're doing. We're completely wasting our money. We're not moving the field forward. We're not proving incremental efficacy. Of course, he had no good ideas how we would do it differently, but he complained about how we were doing it at the time. And so I'm deputy editor of Circulation, which means I get to commission content. So Gabriel's a very close friend, and I went up to him after his discussant presentation. I said, Gabriel, I disagree with everything you just said, but if you want to write it up, we'll publish it. And so we published his tirade in Circulation, 1,200-word criticism of how we were doing things and perhaps some ideas how we might do them better. About the same time, I think it was actually the same month, in Diabetes Care, the similar criticism was published, and this is interesting because it was by Rob Smith, Allison Goldfein, and Will Hyatt, and these are three of the key advisors to the FDA that recommended doing the non-inferiority assessments to begin with. So these people advised the FDA to do this, and now they're saying that we probably should stop doing it. Well, let me remind you, when we do 15,000 patient-year observation studies, we find all kinds of things we never anticipate, and it doesn't have to be cardiovascular or cardiometabolic. So I was on the executive committee of these three trial programs. The first one, the top one, taspoglitide. Taspoglitide was the first once-weekly GLP-1 receptor agonist developed by Roche Pharmaceuticals. And we were 600 patient years into our 7,000 patient trial. We saw nausea. We expect to see nausea with the GLP-1 receptor agonist. We saw some vomiting. That was all anticipated. But what we did not anticipate is 50% of the participants exposed to taspoglitide developed antibodies, and we had anaphylaxis and anaphylactoid reactions, and it killed the compound. That took 600 patient years of observation to detect that signal. So in the old days, bringing a drug to market with 250 patient years, we might have brought this drug to market and exposed millions of people to it and only had to pull it off the market later, maybe after several deaths had occurred. Aliglitazar, the AliCardio trial, this is a dual PPAR alpha gamma agonist in the single tablet. PPAR alpha, like a fibric acid, lowers triglycerides, raises HDL, lowers LDL a little bit, and PPAR gamma, like a thiazolidinedione, like pioglitazone, improves insulin sensitivity. So we were 14,000 patient years of observation. We had enrolled 7,000 patients into a 14,000 patient planned trial. We had a median follow-up of 2 years when the DMC recommended halting the trial, and they saw a signal of upper GI bleeding, a 41% increased risk for upper GI bleeding. How a fibric acid TZD causes upper GI bleeding, we have no idea, but we believe it was true. The curve separated early, and they continued to diverge to where they had a very robust p-value of safety concerns, so killed the class, killed the compound. Fasiglifam, this is a GPR40, a G protein receptor 40 agonist. This is an insulin secretagogue effectively. We were 2,000 patient years into our 6,000 patient trial when we found a clear signal for liver injury, 10-fold increased risk for LFT abnormalities, killed the compound and killed the class. We would have never seen these adverse effects had we been bringing drugs to market without these so-called cardiovascular outcomes trials. We're finding in these large patient year exposures things that have nothing to do with diabetes or cardiovascular disease, but things that kill drugs. And if we don't keep them from the humans, they will kill people. So getting back to the diabetes space, we discovered in this SAVOR a very surprising finding that saxagliptin increases heart failure risk by 27%. Now, to the credit of all of the drug companies we've worked with, I've worked on most of the trials I'll be talking about today. To their credit, the drug companies took our academic advice and agreed to collect heart failure outcomes, even though the FDA did not require it and it wasn't in the prioritized hierarchy of testing in most of the trials. They spent the money and made the effort and collected heart failure outcomes and centrally adjudicated them. So these are bona fide heart failure events, as legitimate as anything we would have in a heart failure-based trial. And then with saxagliptin, we're completely convinced this is a real problem and a 27% increased risk. And on the same day, at the same meeting, the examine trial of allogliptin, I was not involved in this trial, another DPP-4 inhibitor was presented and had a safety signal of concern of a 19% increased risk for heart failure. This did not achieve nominal significance, but it looks more similar to than different from the SAVOR trial. So we think we have a problem with heart failure in the DPP-4 inhibitors. So I was on the executive committee of TCOS that was ongoing at the time these trials were reported, and I was the chair of the Carmelina trial. And so in those two trials, since they were ongoing and blinded, we were able to prospectively plan and file with the FDA a statistical analysis plan for heart failure-based outcomes. So unlike dredging a database and finding some spurious findings like we may have done with the SAVOR trial, although I don't believe we did, when you don't pre-specify analyses and outcomes, you can actually find things that aren't true, alpha error or false positives. So what we were able to prove with prospectively planned heart failure collection and analysis, that there is absolutely no safety signal with sitagliptin, and if anything, linagliptin goes in a favorable direction. We wouldn't claim that linagliptin reduces risk for heart failure, but it's certainly safe from a heart failure perspective. So all of this to say, if you're a cardiologist, I think most of us in cardiology are not treating hyperglycemia per se, and we don't have much use for these drugs. But if you inherit a patient on a DPP-4 inhibitor, I would strongly encourage it to only be sitagliptin or linagliptin from a cardiovascular perspective. So that's the glass half empty part of the talk. Now we go to the glass half full, where we have really revolutionized the care of patients with type 2 diabetes with two novel classes of medications that you all have become familiar with and hopefully are becoming familiar with prescribing. So the SGLT inhibitors, and I take the SGLT2 out of here because we now have an approved SGLT1/2 antagonist, sotagliflozin. So these are SGLT inhibitors. They inhibit reabsorption of glucose that's filtered in the glomerulus. And so they cause urinary glucose excretion, and by doing so, they lower blood glucose. They were initially brought to market to treat hyperglycemia, but as you all are aware, in the cardiovascular outcomes trials, we have seen consistent and robust clinical benefits on both atherosclerotic-based cardiovascular outcomes and, most importantly, in this class, heart failure-related outcomes, as Akshay and I think Mikhail probably mentioned as well. These have revolutionized the care of patients with heart failure and those at risk for heart failure, achieving a level 1A indication. This is a meta-analysis. These are all trials that were placebo-controlled in patients with type 2 diabetes with or at high risk for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. They all had cardiovascular death, MI, and stroke as the primary outcome, which is represented here in this meta-analysis that we published in the wake of the final results of the last of the 4 or 5 trial programs, the Virtus CV trial of ertugliflozin. So we have IMPA-REG outcome, the very first positive clinical outcomes trial in the history of diabetes research. This happened in September of 2015. There's never been a type 1 diabetes clinical outcomes trial that's been positive, and this was the first type 2 diabetes trial that was positive for real clinical outcomes that patients experienced. So empagliflozin improved risk for cardiovascular death, MI, and stroke by 14%, and then soon to follow was the CANVAS trials program, 2 different trials combined for one analysis of canagliflozin versus placebo. And talk about scientific replication. Look at these point estimates and confidence intervals. To the 1,000th decimal point, the CANVAS program reproduced the IMPA-REG outcome program for 3-point MACE, cardiovascular death, MI, and stroke. So what we have is a pooled estimate of the class of a modest 10% relative risk reduction for ASCVD-based events and some heterogeneity within the class. So ertugliflozin in the Virtus trial and dapagliflozin in the DECLARE trial failed to achieve statistical significant improvement in 3-point MACE. But what all of these drugs do, and do consistently, absolutely 100% consistent across trials, is this 32% relative risk reduction in heart failure-related outcomes. Now, these are trials of people with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, not heart failure per se, although there were people with heart failure entering these trials. This is predominantly a primary prevention, high-risk patient population to develop heart failure, and we are preventing it with these drugs by 32%. And again, this is added on top of contemporary excellent clinical care for cardiovascular risk mitigation in persons with type 2 diabetes. So this is just a graphical summary of what we've seen across the platform of these SGLT2 inhibitors, and what I've added here at the bottom now is the SOLOIST trial. This is an acute decompensated heart failure trial randomizing patients with heart failure of any etiology and type 2 diabetes to the dual SGLT1/2 antagonist sotagliflozin. And in parallel, we conducted the SCORE trial. Deepak led these trials along with Gabriel Steig and I. And the SCORE trial was a high-risk ASCVD patient population, also treated with sotagliflozin versus placebo. The sponsor pulled the funding for these trials. We had to stop these trials before they were completed, and actually probably only about 50 to 60% of trial completion for patient exposure, but we got lucky. This is a very good drug, and we were able to achieve statistically significant demonstration of statistically significant reduction in cardiovascular outcomes despite having an underpowered trial data set because we had to stop the trials early because of a business decision of Sanofi. So we've published these data. They now have FDA approval. Sotagliflozin is approved for the treatment of acute decompensated heart failure and chronically, and it's also approved for the use in people with type 2 diabetes to reduce cardiovascular risk. And so we now have sotagliflozin, empagliflozin, and dapagliflozin with pretty robust data and pretty similar data. And we believe that even outside the product labeling, all of the drugs in this class or this mechanism, all of them similarly affect heart failure outcomes. So my practice is to pick the drug I think is best, but also pick the drug that the patient can afford. And sometimes that's a drug without evidence base, like bexigliflozin has come to market to treat hyperglycemia. It has favorable point estimates of cardiovascular, but it hasn't rigorously assessed cardiovascular disease and does not and will not get a cardiovascular indication. Then we'll flip the switch. You heard just a little bit towards the end of Akshay's talk and with Mikhail, the GLP-1 receptor agonists are really permeating into many aspects of our cardiovascular care. And we have 3 drugs on the top here: liraglutide, once daily injections; semaglutide and dulaglutide, once weekly injections. These all 3 have proven cardiovascular efficacy, have product labeled indication by the FDA. Just 10 days ago, I chaired the SOUL trial, co-chaired with John Buse, of oral semaglutide. So oral semaglutide versus placebo, and we have top-line results presented just last Monday by the company. We demonstrated a statistically significant 14% relative risk reduction with oral semaglutide. So we have yet another formulation of a GLP-1 receptor agonist that will get a product label indication and will also enter the guidelines. On the bottom here is tirzepatide. This is a dual agonist of GLP-1 and GIP. Tirzepatide is being studied in several trials. I'm on the executive committee of the cardiovascular outcomes trial called SURPASS CVOT. That's ongoing, and we'll probably have results about tirzepatide cardiovascular safety and efficacy in about a year from that trial. But just to summarize here, these are the 3 trials in red boxes that have led to product labeled indications: the LEADER trial for liraglutide, the SUSTAIN 6 trial for injectable semaglutide, and the REWIND trial for dulaglutide. And this is the company announcement I just mentioned about the SOUL trial of 14% reduction. And importantly, in this trial, the company chose to pick one data point in addition to the primary outcome to put in the press release, which always bothers me that they're presenting data in a press release. But we had about 50% of patients were treated with SGLT2 inhibitors during this trial. And so we're going to have an ability to look at the interaction of the 2 drugs combined. This is not a randomized treatment of SGLT2, so it will be observational comparative effectiveness research, but we have a very sophisticated plan to analyze this, and this is the largest patient population where we have concomitant treatment with the 2. And I'll come back to the importance of that comment later. This is the design of the SURPASS trial. I think it's curious. This is the first active controlled trial in the diabetes space, so we got to a point where it's no longer ethical to do placebo-controlled trials, and it challenges trial performance if people are randomized to placebo when they can get open access to a GLP-1 receptor agonist. So we took a swing for the fence and negotiated with the FDA a very creative statistical analysis plan. So we've planned to prove a non-inferiority against dulaglutide, and if we succeed there, we will use an imputed placebo event rate to claim superiority against a placebo. It's a very creative, I have to say, and we'll see. The FDA has bought it. We'll see if the advisory committee does. So look, where has this gotten us in the guidelines? And so the American Diabetes Association has lagged behind the data about 5 years, and so they've slowly updated their guidance year over year, and finally in 2023, and here's the 2024 Standards of Medical Care, they have finally gotten it close to right. And so what you see on the left is if a person has type 2 diabetes and they have either atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease on the top left, in the middle, indicators of high risk, so age 55 with 1 or more additional cardiovascular risk factors. In the red, if they have heart failure, and in the brown, if they have chronic kidney disease. If they have any of these comorbidities, you start with a GLP-1 receptor agonist or an SGLT2 inhibitor. What you don't see anywhere in this panel is the drug metformin. So no longer is metformin first. If a person has these comorbidities, it's a GLP-1 receptor agonist. So here the ADA gets it right. Pick one or the other and start it. Here's where the ADA gets it wrong. There's nothing about A1C that we're treating. We're treating cardiovascular risk. We don't need to measure the A1C and then decide to add the other one. We need to just add the other one, and I'll come back to that. And then they say, for patients on GLP-1, consider adding an SGLT2. For people on an SGLT2, consider adding a GLP-1. You really need to consider those both. We don't do this with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, that you choose a beta blocker or an MRA, or, I mean, that's just nonsense, right? So we need to get past that. And interestingly, they have put back into their primary algorithm and ahead of metformin, pioglitazone. They say TZD because they're chicken to name a drug, but pioglitazone is the TZD. And I think that's interesting. And that's interesting because the European Society of Cardiology presents guidelines, and they update their guidelines more commonly than the American societies. And on each guideline writing committee, they're privileged to have one single non-European member. And so I got to be the one single non-European member on this guideline. And I got to write the anti-hyperglycemic chapter in the European guidelines. And this is where I make the point, is we have taken a step ahead of the ADA, and we are endorsing independent of A1C present, independent of A1C target, and independent of background therapy, including independent of metformin use. You start a GLP-1 receptor agonist and an SGLT2 inhibitor. I prefer to start the SGLT2 inhibitor first. Nothing to titrate, nothing to monitor, and very well tolerated. What you don't want to do, start them at the same time. The person gets nausea with the GLP-1 receptor agonist, and they want to stop both the drugs. And so I would encourage you to start one, and then within a week or 2 or 3, start the other. The other thing we see with the SGLT2 inhibitors is the effect on heart failure emerges extraordinarily early. So you don't want to waste a day not treating for the heart failure risk. And then we put metformin above pioglitazone, but we also added pioglitazone independent of A1C to consider for cardiovascular risk mitigation. And so we need to be using these drugs as cardiologists. They are cardiovascular medications. They now have level 1A indications in the cardiology guidelines. They need to be part of our routine use, just like a statin. So you saw Mikhail this morning. I commissioned him to write this provocative piece about whose responsibility is it to prescribe these? Now, this was published in 2018, and we were slowly, as cardiologists, coming on board to this. But he uses the parable of who's going to bell the cat. And so there's a story about this family of mice living in a house, and they're living happily in the house, and then the owner gets a cat. And they're scared to death. How are we going to know when the cat's coming around? And somebody has the brilliant idea, well, let's put a bell on the cat's neck so we can hear it coming. And everybody's celebrating and excited, and then they got quiet and said, well, who's going to put the bell on the cat? Right? So whose responsibility is this to bell the cat or prescribe these medications? Again, commissioning content. I got my buddy David Cherney, a nephrologist, diabetes-based nephrologist, and Jay Udell, a cardiologist at University of Toronto, to give us a 1,200-word primer for dummies for cardiologists. Here's what you have to think about. Here's what you need to recommend and counsel patients when you're starting SGLT2 inhibitors. And similarly, in Circulation, we published this by the endocrinologist Ildi Lingvei and Larry Leader, a primer on how to prescribe GLP-1 receptor agonists. These take some time. You have to counsel the patient. Everybody's going to get nauseated at the first dose. You need to start at the lowest dose and not titrate until the nausea is gone. For some people, that's 2 weeks. For some people, that's 2 months. But don't titrate until the nausea is gone. So with that, we have an abundance of evidence because the regulators required it, and now our patients are benefiting from this huge body of work that's happened over the last 15 years, proving first cardiovascular safety and ultimately efficacy of these novel classes of medications, pulling them squarely into the cardiology toolbox. And so we really need, as a cardiology community, to embrace these drugs and use them for patients who have access to them and have indication. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you, Dr. Sharma.